We are now officially hours away from the first public impeachment hearing for President Trump. So why is Trump so close to impeachment? What would Congress impeach him for? That's not a rhetorical question. House Democrats have argued Trump has broken more than one law and violated the Constitution several times over. But impeachment remains a grave and constitutionally mandated act. Congress must choose only impeachable defined offenses. And now, on the cusp of these hearings, keep in mind, even after the Mueller report, even after this Ukraine whistleblower news broke into the open, many top Democrats remained pretty vague, perhaps deliberately vague, about what exactly they might impeach Trump for.
The president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections.
The more that they fight to try to prevent and obstruct the lawful functions of Congress, the more they're going to make a case for impeachment on obstruction of justice.
Congress can impeach for obstruction of justice and abuse of power in general. And the impeachment probes of, say, Nixon or Clinton, they pursued several articles of impeachment, including obstruction. But as this evidence piled up in the Ukraine scandal, including the televised confessions from both President Trump and Chief of Staff Mulvaney, I think it became clear that the strongest impeachment case on these facts is specifically for bribery. Let me explain. On the facts, well, it's because of the evidence. And on the law, well, it's because of the Constitution, which only lists two specific offenses as impeachable: treason and bribery. So unlike other allegations, no one can deny that bribery is impeachable because the Constitution says it is. The case here is that Donald Trump abused his official powers to demand a bribe from Ukraine, asking for that favor to go after Trump's rival, Joe Biden, a request that Donald Trump himself admits. Now, as this story unfolded, most people weren't really talking about bribery in D.C. I found that odd, given this case. So I did what we all do around here sometimes. I reported out the bribery case on air. And then about 3 weeks ago, I wrote it up in this article for the Washington Post. Bribery is right there in the Constitution. Trump could be impeached for that. And here's how I put it then. Democrats haven't settled on a core legal rationale for impeachment, which is striking considering the Constitution's answer is staring them in the face. Trump's actions regarding Ukraine appear to fit one of the few offenses the Constitution specifically lists as impeachable: bribery. Focusing on bribery also distinguishes this from the two other impeachment votes in all of history for Presidents Clinton and Johnson, which often bogged down by questions of what defines a high crime or misdemeanor in the Constitution. And let me tell you something, and you might hear these debates in the coming weeks. Honestly, no one can say for sure because the Constitution itself doesn't say. Now, one of the fascinating parts about living in 2019 is I think we're all exploring these issues together sometimes. And it feels like America basically is going through law school together as we study different abuses and allegations against Trump and his officials and some of his convicted aides. Well, here on MSNBC, we get to learn from all kinds of experts and lately a lot of prosecutors. Take David Kelly, former top prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. Well, he held that same job that you've heard of from Rudy Giuliani to Preet Bharara. It's a big post. And when we were talking to him about all this, he told us most defendants in a bribery case facing the evidence against Trump right now, they wouldn't even make it to trial. They would plead guilty.
I doubt that this is a case that would really go to trial. When confronted with all the evidence, a reasonable defendant would likely take a plea.
You're saying someone presented with this evidence, like
it's pretty damning evidence.
Damning evidence. And bribery is impeachable. And there's lots of evidence of bribery. And that brings us to tonight. On the eve of these first impeachment hearings, the Democrats' point person on impeachment, Adam Schiff, coming out to unveil a potential framework for how Congress may now impeach President Trump.
First of all, as the founders understood bribery, it was not as we understand it in law today. It was much broader. It connoted the breach of the public trust in a way where you're offering official acts for some personal or political reason, not in the nation's interest.
That is from Chairman Schiff's new NPR interview, which is making new headlines about Democrats right here. Potentially impeachable offenses include bribery against Trump. Why is Schiff saying this now, heading into the first hearing? Is he trying to shape how his colleagues run the questions tomorrow? and what the public, what you should listen for? Is the Congress aiming for a narrow or broader set of articles of impeachment? I don't know, but our next guest might. Former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirschner joins me next. We are back. I want to welcome former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirschner. Sir, as mentioned, there were many arguments about what is potentially impeachable. I laid out and reported and wrote up the bribery case a few weeks ago. What do you make of particularly Adam Schiff, who's so pivotal here, raising that tonight? And will it be relevant in the questioning tomorrow?
Yeah, Ari, you were right 3 weeks ago, and you're right tonight about focusing on bribery. And let me do this. Let me just tweak the facts a little bit to try to make it crystal clear why what President Trump did is, in fact, bribery. And then we'll come back to the actual facts and talk about those. Let's assume that this $400 million, nearly $400 million that Congress had appropriated that was supposed to go to Ukraine to help protect against Russian aggression. Let's assume the president, in his discussion with President Zelensky, said, I am going to give you this $400 million, but only if you give me a $1 million kickback.
Right.
I think everybody would recognize that's bribery. That's an abuse of office. That's a violation of the public trust. That's impeachable. Now, let's go back
to your point. The political kickback was way more valuable than $1 million.
Exactly. And that's where I want to go, because everybody would say under that hypothetical, oh, my goodness, that's an impeachable offense. Let's talk about what the president actually did. He said, I will give you these $400 million, but only if you essentially stand in front of a camera and announce a criminal investigation into my political opponent. Let's think about how much more valuable than $1 million that is to President Trump. First of all, he wants to be reelected in the worst way for a couple of reasons. One, I think he wants to keep having all of that emoluments clause cheese rolling in, courtesy of him exploiting his properties. But even more importantly, what we haven't discussed recently is the only way President Trump avoids prison is to remain president, because we can't indict a sitting president. The only way he can be indicted, charged criminally, tried, convicted, and imprisoned under the OLC memo, ill-advised though it may be, is if he's no longer the sitting president. So how much more valuable than $1 million kickback, which we all acknowledge would be wrong, is what he was proposing to President Zelensky? Help me unfairly win re-election. Ari, as you've been saying, that's bribery all along. It's misuse of his government official position in order to get a personal benefit to him. And there is no greater benefit than getting reelected.
Yeah, especially in this context. It's really striking. It obviously struck my ear what Congressman Schiff said today. And viewers will note we had two members of Congress earlier in the show who sounded more like what other Democrats had sounded like a few weeks ago, which is, hey, there's a menu, there's a lot of things. I think prosecutors like you know, if you're pushing the case, you need to be crystal clear about what's most important. The jury walks out of there more often with one idea than 4 or 5. I got to hand it over to Brian Williams, Glenn. So thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.